Hello everyone from Michele Caldo with Everify again. It is now 11 a.m. Pacific time. I believe that's 2 p.m. for the folks on the East Coast. We'll be starting the webinar as predicted. So I just wanted to share a few housekeeping items before we start. If you've been on our webinars before, you should already know this. For those of you who are new, you can see there's a question box on the right-hand side of your screen. That's where we'll ask you if you could type your questions about the presentations. What we usually do is we'll select a handful of them when we have time, and we'll answer them. For those questions that we can't answer live, we'll make sure we get back to you on an individual basis and get your a reply on your queries. Also, I'd like to mention that a copy of the slide deck of this presentation will be made available to all of you together with a full recording of the event by virtue of a follow-up email that will also include a couple useful resources. Lastly, when you log out of this event, right at the end, there will be a short poll where we ask you about your feedback on the event. We do value your feedback greatly, so if you could please fill that in. We'll review your answers closely, and we'll keep them in great consideration when planning future events. And now, let's talk about today's topic. So, as many of you know, today on the line, this is the fourth and last event of our four-part series on campus prevention best practices. Today's focus will be on programming, and in particular, programming as a process. Here today on the line with me is my colleague, Erin McClintock. Hello, Erin.
Hi, everyone.
We hear you loud and clear, Erin. So Erin is Director of Partner Education at Everify here. She works with campuses throughout the U.S. to support their ongoing prevention initiatives and align them with best practices for creating meaningful change. Erin joined Everify with over a decade of experience in educational health and wellness. Previously, she was responsible for the oversight of wellness and prevention education at Clark University in Worcester, where she supported the community through comprehensive AOD, mental health, and violence prevention work. So Erin, why don't you start us off on the topic today?
Great. Thank you, Michele, for the wonderful introduction. I want to welcome all of you, and I want to thank you in advance for spending the next hour with me. I know an hour is a long time, and we have a fair amount to cover, but I'm hopeful that we can all get through it. As many of you know, and as Michele alluded to, this is the last in a four-part series, and we focused really on the major building blocks of effective prevention work, as well as how they can create truly meaningful change within the higher ed landscape. I'm excited to wrap up our web series as we talk about one of the primary pillars of this work, programming. As Michele mentioned, prior to joining the Everify team, I worked on a campus where I actually oversaw prevention work as it related to sexual assault, mental health, and alcohol and other drugs. So when we started talking about this webinar series and we were deciding which team member would take on which topic, I immediately volunteered to do programming. Having just come from a campus, I thought, obviously I'm going to pick programming. It should be easy. Then I dove into the research. I talked to a lot of people doing a lot of really great work in this space, and I recognized the need to tell a story a little bit differently around how we think about programming. It's something that we as professionals are likely spending a great deal of our time and energy on, as well as a lot of our resources, so it's crucial that we look at it from a critical lens. In today's webinar, I'd like to focus on a rethinking of how we're defining programming. I'll also highlight some innovative and high-fidelity ways in which institutions are currently implementing certain programs on their campuses. And finally, I hope to both affirm your ongoing efforts and what we already know, while challenging you to think of a new and innovative way to conceptualize what a program is. Now, as Michele mentioned, we're going to spend some time at the end of the webinar answering questions. So please feel free as we go through it. If something comes up, just write it in the box to your right. And at the end, if there are questions that we don't get to, I'll make it a point to connect with you offline to answer your question as best I can. I'm also hoping for you to get involved in the process as well. So at various points throughout the webinar, I'm going to be putting up some poll questions. Hopefully this will be a chance for us to get a sense of the broader picture of programming. How are we using it? What are our obstacles? And where can we make progress? So in the spirit of learning, let's open with a poll question. All of you are clearly here because you want to learn more about effective prevention work. So I'm curious, what are your greatest programmatic challenges? Now I sat down, and Michaeli, can you just launch the poll? I sat down and I really tried to think of as many as I could, but I also recognize that this list certainly does not cover everything. So if you could just select one of these that may apply to you on campus or at the institution that you're at, that would be great. Wonderful. So responses are coming in. We've got nearly 60% of you that have already voted. So far, lack of resources in terms of funding and staffing is leading the pack, with student engagement being a close second. We'll leave this open for another minute or so. Great, got about 80% in. Lack of resources is still leading the pack. 41% report that lack of resources is the biggest challenge, followed by student engagement at 37%. Two things, particularly the student engagement piece, that we will be covering in this webinar. Also happy to see that identifying the problem is not an issue for anyone, so we're off to a good start with that as well. Thank you. So collectively, our two biggest challenges are lack of resources and student engagement. And I'm really looking forward to addressing at least one of those in the webinar today. So far, and I don't know how many of you in the audience or listening have attended all 4 parts of this series, but so far this webinar series has focused on prevention from a variety of different lenses. All of them are interconnected to really encompass effective practice. So in the model that you see on your screen, programming sits at the top of the pyramid. And so this isn't to say that it's insignificant or that it's unimportant when compared to the other prevention initiatives that you see, but rather that it's best done when supported by the practices that come before it. Solid institutional buy-in and support, effective critical processes and data collection, legislation and policy are all helpful in driving and supporting effective, sustainable, and impactful programs. If you've been a part of this webinar series from the beginning, you've already heard my colleague Rob Bulow talk about institutionalization and its impact on prevention programming, especially when it comes to funding, which many of us identified as a barrier. Lauren Woolley's presentation on critical processes validated that data can and should be used to evaluate programmatic efforts. And Kimberly Timp's session on policy helped us to recognize the ways that policy can drive urgency and mandate certain programmatic efforts. Programming is also a multifaceted entity, right? It's an outward manifestation of our comprehensive efforts. It's often how we demonstrate to students, to our peers, to our administrators, the truly hard work that happens behind the scenes. It's a way of quantifying and extending the reach of the work that we do, and it's a way of being heard on the issues. It's also a way to engage others in our efforts. Programming is also something that can be used to amplify or improve those efforts. It's much more than an event or an initiative. It's the product or products of thought, effort, deliberateness, and creativity. Again, it's important to note that when we think about programs, we're not referring to one-time events. We're not referring to one-shot deals. We're really thinking about the direct output of a deliberate, strategic, and data-informed comprehensive prevention plan. It's important to think about programming as both an extension out and an invitation in. It's how we can be vocal and present by outwardly demonstrating something related to our efforts, while also inviting others to learn about or become a part of the crucial work that we're doing. Now, when we conceptualize programming, it's important to acknowledge that programming is, again, the culmination of our efforts, and we can put it forth in a variety of different ways. On the screen, you see just a few examples. Programming, again, is not necessarily just a one-time offering, but rather a deliberate and strategic combination of several integrated efforts. It's not only about the programmatic efforts themselves, but the thought and intent behind them. Who are we targeting? How often are we offering programs? What theories or data are we using to drive forward progress and ensure that the programs we're putting in place are actually meeting the needs of our community? In today's presentation, we're going to explore all of this and more. Now, throughout this presentation, I'll also be sharing some insights that we've gleaned from two of EverFi's really informative and groundbreaking prevention tools. Both our alcohol diagnostic inventory and our sexual assault diagnostic inventory explore prevention efforts from the lens of institutionalization, critical processes, and programming. The alcohol diagnostic also touches upon policy. The sexual assault diagnostic does not. Both of these tools were developed to support the work of our partners, and they were based on key research into best practice recommendations that really look at what works and what doesn't in the prevention sphere. We've had nearly 100 schools complete each and have been able to get a sense of what schools are doing in each arena, as well as what areas they may be able to improve on. So throughout this session, I'm really looking forward to sharing some of those insights with you. In thinking about prevention programs that will actually make an impact, it's really important to look to the literature to see what has been deemed effective. The Principles of Effective Prevention by Nation et al. From 2003 is a really well-known and excellent example that refers not just to programs, but to the process of prevention as a whole. When we think about programs in particular, they should be comprehensive, they should be part of a bigger picture of a deliberate strategic plan, and they should be theory-driven. They should also be focused on cultivating positive relationships and be evaluated. So just for fun, let's look at the Principles of Effective Prevention recommendations through the lens of a commonly used program on many campuses, Alcohol Awareness Week. Now, in thinking about the best use of our resources and programming time, we have to call into question, is Alcohol Awareness Week the most effective use of our time and resources? Yes, it does raise awareness, absolutely, so that box is checked. It may create additional dialogue, certainly, but what else? It's not necessarily relevant entirely to our campus. It's very difficult to evaluate, and it's not theory-driven. But many, if not most campuses, continue to do it. Now, this conversation is certainly not meant to shame anyone who is doing it, because my guess would be that, a good majority of us are. And it, along with any other program, can certainly be effective when it's done strategically and integrated with other efforts. That said, though, when we look at any potential program, it's really important to look at it through the lens of our holistic prevention efforts and ask the question, what are we really getting out of this? So hopefully this framework is an effective one to consider the next time you contemplate a programmatic endeavor. Look to the Principles of Effective Prevention, look to the key points that it references, and ask, is this program meeting the needs of my community, or is there a better way that I could spend my time, my resources, my person power, etc.? So how do we begin to identify what works and what doesn't? Well, fortunately, there's a fair amount of literature that can assist us. Although at this point, there's much, much more out there that relates to alcohol prevention on campus than there is that relates to sexual assault prevention, we do have some resources we can look to. A recent document published by the CDC does a great job of painting a picture of strategies for effective violence prevention, particularly on college campuses. And in this slide, we highlight some of what we know to be true about violence prevention programming. So what works? Well, we know that legislation drives many of our program mandates, which forces us by the letter of the law to expand the scope of our reach, as well as those groups that we're expected to target. We also know that online education is an incredibly effective population-level strategy. Almost just as importantly, however, let's take a look at the right side of the screen and what doesn't work. This echoes the sentiment of this webinar. Brief, one-session educational interventions do not work at changing awareness, attitudes, beliefs, or knowledge. Truly effective prevention programs are those that are coordinated, system-wide, and involve buy-in from a multitude of key players. Now, the same sentiments have been determined to be true in the alcohol prevention sphere. So the EverFi Compass tool, some of you may be familiar with it, some of you may not, highlights the most and least efficacious programs related to alcohol prevention, as well as the costs associated with each. We'll get into that more in a little bit. What's interesting in this arena, as well as in the sexual assault arena, is that the programs that we most frequently use as practitioners are not always the ones that have been proven to be most effective. As I said, we'll take an even deeper dive into this in a little bit, but for the purposes of today's session, I wanted to orient each of us to the same way of thinking. So what makes a good program? First, it's comprehensive. It speaks to the bigger picture of prevention efforts. Second, it's repeatable. It's something that we can replicate and reproduce at different times of the year as needed or with each incoming cohort of students. A big part of ensuring this is evaluation. It's really important to evaluate our programs regularly to ensure that they're still relevant when it's time for them to be repeated. Speaking of relevance, it's also important for programs to be relevant to your community. This is especially true when we think of a programmatic effort like a social norms campaign or a bystander intervention campaign. We want to be sure that the programs that we're developing or implementing are in alignment with what our institutional and behavioral needs of our institution actually are. There are a ton of really creative and engaging programs out there. I'm on listservs all the time, hearing about the cool and innovative things that schools are doing, and the field of prevention professionals as a whole is a really creative one. That said, it's important to be deliberate about choosing one to ensure that we're catering specifically to the communities that we work in. One size does not always fit all. So just because something works at the institution down the street or at the groundbreaking institution across the country doesn't necessarily mean that it will work for our community. It's important to look at it through the lens of your campus and the unique needs of your campus before you spend your time and energy and resources implementing it. Fourth, programs should be collaborative. Who else can we bring in to assist with programmatic outcomes? Is there someone on campus that can help with staffing or promoting or data collection? Look to your peers and find potential allies. Perhaps even make a list of those people on campus that you could collaborate with. As prevention professionals, we're often offices of one or two. I know that when I was on a campus, that was certainly the case. Building relationships can be a tremendously powerful way of extending our reach while also recruiting others to be ambassadors of our message in the process. And finally, I've said it before and I'll say it again and again and again, programs should be part of a bigger prevention process. Now we're about to dive into some specific programs and insights from campuses, but I want to spend just a couple of minutes reorienting ourselves with some of the basics. It wouldn't be a programming webinar without at least touching upon some key concepts. The Institute of Medicine, as many of you will know, has identified 3 primary types of programs and 3 distinct audiences for those programs. Depending on our goals, it's important to target the unique needs and characteristics of the audiences that we're trying to engage, whether those are universal, selective, or indicated. Throughout this presentation, whenever applicable, and I'm showing case studies from schools, you'll see these icons at the top of the screen to highlight whether a specific programmatic effort is universal, selective, or indicated. And sometimes you'll see them more than once for programs that are versatile. When considering programs, it's also important to look at timing. There tend to exist 3 primary program types when it comes to timing. Primary is typically before a program occurs or in anticipation of it. It's often the first attempt at instituting an overall prevention effort. Next are secondary programs. These are sort of related to risk reduction or early identification of potential symptoms or risks, and are often done during or immediately after a need has been identified. Finally, we have tertiary, or the after. These are typically programs that are conducted in response to something and often involve treatment, recovery, or enforcement. A great example of a tertiary program is the recovery efforts that are happening on so many campuses. These are programmatic efforts that are emerging more frequently at institutions throughout the nation. When thinking about timing, it's also crucial to look at the current climate in our communities. First, how does the potential program tie in with the school calendar? For example, for many of you right now is the last week of classes before winter break. It's probably not the most ideal time to hold a mandatory training on sexual assault prevention because students have a million other things on their plates. It may, however, be a perfect time to hold a programmatic event that speaks to the stresses associated with final exams. And I'm sure many of you are actually doing that. Second, can a program be tied in with other institutional efforts? Is there an ongoing institutional goal, a larger conversation, or a campaign that's happening that we can integrate our efforts with? And finally, what is happening nationally or socially around the issue? Considering these questions can help us tailor our messaging and scheduling accordingly, but can also to help us anticipate any potential pushback or caution that might need to be taken, particularly from a public relations standpoint. It can also be a determining factor in whether an effort that we're putting forth is done ahead of something or in response to it. We also need to think about the needs of our community. What do they already know about the issue? What are their current beliefs or values as related to it? Are there certain specific behaviors in our community that we're hoping to change? Also, is the program and the intended efforts of the program, is it appropriate? Is it appropriate for a specific group, an entire community, or the issue as a whole? Gathering data, whether it's a climate survey, looking at police, EMS, or residence hall reports, or exploring your impact reports from Alcohol EDU and Haven, can all be a crucial part of that process. So we spent some time going over the basics of what's effective and what isn't with regards to programming, and now I want to spend some time looking at specific institutional efforts in action. Throughout this section, as I mentioned, I'll be sharing some data insights that we've gleaned from our two diagnostic inventories, so the alcohol diagnostic inventory and the sexual assault diagnostic inventory. I'll also be sharing some insights based on overall data that refers to research into best practice. So we've already established what doesn't work when it comes to prevention, one-time programs. We know they don't work. Here's a glimpse into what we are doing from a violence prevention standpoint. As you can see from this slide, and this refers to data that we've gleaned from our sexual assault diagnostic inventory, some of the most frequently used programs by schools are things like awareness events, tabling events and invited speakers, first-year engagement, online education. While some of the least frequently used are things like social norms marketing, bystander intervention, and course engagement. Now, what's really interesting about this is that those programs that historically have the least efficacy with regards to prevention, based on research, are those that are being used the most frequently, while those that have the most efficacy are those that are being used the least frequently. So what's causing this? Is it cost of programs? Is it time? Is it resources? Interestingly enough, the programs that are most efficacious are surprisingly also often most cost-effective. That begs the question, when resources are finite, it's really, really important that we think about what will get us the most bang for our buck, both financially and time-wise. Now we see something similar play out in the alcohol sphere. I referred earlier to our Compass tool, which explores programmatic efforts from the lens of cost versus benefits and ranks programs based on total cost, scope of reach, and efficacy. So you can see an example of the compass depicted on this slide on the right-hand side. The size of the bubble portrayed represents the scope of reach, or how many students can be reached through a specific intervention. The bigger the bubble, the larger audience that it can reach. The y-axis represents the total programmatic cost, and the x-axis represents overall impact. The chart on the left refers to data that we've obtained from our alcohol diagnostic inventory and refers to how many schools are implementing a program based on how they responded. So where you see 8, 53, 55, that's how many schools are implementing that particular program. You'll notice that things like invited speakers have very little proven impact. They're all the way on the left, and the bubble's pretty small in the compass measurement, but they're being used in almost 3/4 of schools. So let's break this down. Recently, I was on a listserv, and the topic of fatal vision goggles came up. Let's take a look at something like fatal vision goggles versus group motivational enhancement, with GME abbreviated on this. 64% of schools report using fatal vision goggles, while only 8% report using group motivational enhancement. Now, when we look at where each falls on the compass, we see that GME, all the way over on the right, has a far greater impact and a far greater reach. So why then are we more likely to use fatal vision goggles than group motivational enhancement, when we know that there's minimal effectiveness to them? So I'd like to turn it over to you. In your own words, in your own work, why might you choose some programs over others? Is it convenience? Is it reputation? Is it lack of resources, whether it's time, finances, or person power? What's driving the effort behind the programs that you choose or choose not to implement? So far, kind of tied, we've got ease of implementation and proven efficacy. And we've got about 65% of you that have voted. Thank you for doing so. About 75% in. So far, ease of implementation is at about 46% of us, which makes sense given how busy we are. Proven efficacy is about 23%, cost is 15%, scalability is at 13%, and notoriety or reputation is at 3%. So we'll give it few more seconds, see if we can get some more votes. All right, thank you. So leading the pack is ease of implementation. And that makes sense, right? The goal of looking at this too is not to say you're doing it wrong, or that those of us who are doing programs out of convenience or ease are somehow less invested in the work than others. The reality is that this is really tough work, and we're often tasked with a million different hats to wear. So hopefully, by the end of this webinar, you'll at least be able to apply a different lens to how you're thinking about programming. And ultimately, hopefully, you'll be able to use your time and resources in a way that will work better both for you as professionals and for the communities that you serve. We're really thinking about how we can work smarter and not necessarily harder. Now I just have to reorient myself to the slides after the poll. Great. So who are we reaching? Let's take a look at that. We've explored how we're reaching students, so now let's take a look at who we are reaching. This slide relates to data from our sexual assault diagnostic, which again is, our sample size is 38, but I'd be interested in seeing how it mirrors other efforts on campuses. Now within the violence prevention sphere, we know across the board there are certain groups that are very frequently targeted. First-year students, RAs, student athletes, all widely represented. Some of this is certainly due to legislative requirements. Some of it's probably, going back to the last question, due to ease of accessibility. There are a lot of programs out there that already exist that really speak well to some of these groups. And while they're certainly important groups to target, it's also important to look at those that we may not be reaching. LGBTQ students, non-traditional students, students with disabilities. The groups that are the least frequently targeted are also those groups that we know are statistically more likely to experience some form of sexualized violence at some point in their lives. It's worth noting and acknowledging that these groups tend to be more difficult to reach, and sometimes privacy plays a large role. But it certainly begs the question, how can we reach them? What can we be doing to increase our efforts in connecting with these students? Now I'd like to highlight a few examples of schools that are doing just that. The University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill is one example that I wanted to share for the ways that they're deliberately targeting their LGBT students. Now, this university recognized that there was more that could be done to connect with these students, particularly on the issues of sexual and relationship violence. So their Student Wellness Center and their LGBTQ Center collaborated to develop several online modules meant to reach members of this community. The listing on the left-hand side of your screen speaks to what those modules were. This collaboration is truly aligned with the spirit of effective prevention. By putting the modules online, UNC created an opportunity for students to privately educate themselves on the issues as they relate specifically to their community. Now, since beginning this program, they've seen a fantastic increase in the amount of students that they've been able to reach. This is a really, really great example of what happens when a need is identified, collaboration happens, and a little bit of creativity gets added to the mix. Another group that is worth considering is students with learning differences. Now, this group, of course, can be a bit more difficult to target, especially since there are a variety of ways to learn. No learning difference is the same. And since identifying information about which students fall into this group is often protected under FERPA. Now, that said, it's important to be considerate of how we're connecting with students on our campus that do have learning differences or disabilities. Again, similar to the last slide, one great way to get started is through collaboration. Most schools have a disability or accessibility services office, so consider setting up a coffee meeting and talk about how you might collaborate with them. If this isn't possible, then at the very least, make sure that your campus disability office has a seat at the table when discussing or exploring potential programs. They'll bring a perspective that can help really provide a lens of accessibility to the content matter that's related to this issue, especially because sometimes they can be so nuanced. Even if it's difficult to gather these students for a specific program, it's crucial to consider the ways in which you're currently providing accessibility or not providing accessibility through your current programmatic efforts. The recommendations that I've highlighted on this slide, which again will be sent out to you, are meant to support you in doing that. Another program worth highlighting comes from Duke University by way of Penn State. Those of you who have participated in our policy webinar with Kimberly Timpf may already be familiar with this because I know that she touched upon it. Called AOD Plus, this program was created by David Nallen as an alternative for students who are at risk of being forced to leave the university due to multiple or severe alcohol violations. To participate, students have to apply. So they complete a formal application, then they go through an interview process, and then they need to be accepted into the program, following which they sign a contract of commitment, really buying in right off the bat. Throughout the 13-week program, they meet with key stakeholders, they have weekly meetings with a case manager, and they complete homework assignments that are designed from a wellness-based curriculum. So the focus on this program is not actually on their drinking itself, but rather on their well-being as a whole. When a student's completed the program, then they put together a capstone presentation, and they have a graduation ceremony where they can invite friends, family members, and the mentors that they've met throughout campus along the process. The best part of this program is that there's data behind it. So students who have participated, studies have found that the program has overall been a success. Student well-being increased. Saliency was high for the following 2 years after completion, after which most students ended up graduating. And it was rated very highly by students who have participated. Now, this is a program that really is a shining example of what can happen when everything's mixed together. It was driven and aligned by a policy, it had institutional support and funding behind it, and it used data to tell the story. It's a fantastic example of what can happen when all of these forces unite. So now let's shift gears a little bit and spend some time exploring programmatic efforts that we know are efficacious and ways in which they're being implemented on campuses nationwide. One initiative that many campuses are taking on, and I actually stumbled upon this in a listserv recently also, is alcohol-free events. So here are some snippets at some schools that has found success in this arena. When considering alcohol-free events, it's really important to recognize that they're not meant, again, with the spirit of this presentation, they're not meant to be one-time offerings, but a consistent and institutionalized offering that students can depend on. 88% of schools report that they are using alcohol-free events as part of their programmatic offerings related to alcohol, and this is from our alcohol diagnostic. On this slide, you'll see some examples of some of those schools that are doing this with fidelity. When thinking about institutionalizing alcohol-free events, it's important to seek out the perspective of students. It's also important for them to be consistent. The very nature of their fidelity depends on this. Can students rely on them to happen? It can also be helpful, again in the spirit of collaboration, to explore or tap into events that are already taking place and see if you can join efforts. Finally, this is another great opportunity to look at data, both to identify the need and to determine whether or not your efforts are actually making the difference that you want them to. Another highly efficacious program is Basics. Interestingly, despite that there's a large body of research behind it, it's currently only in place at about 2/3 of the schools that we surveyed. Now, this is a program that's backed by research and has actually been deemed effective at changing intent and behavior. Basics does require some financial investment, as well as some person power investment, and some schools cite the cost associated with it as a reason for not utilizing it. Here we've listed some schools that are utilizing it in a way that has high fidelity. Thinking about this, though, it's worth revisiting that cost-benefit approach to programming. If we have limited resources, are we better off inviting a guest speaker to campus who can speak one time about an issue, or investing our money into a program that could be utilized for years to come? Something to think about. Finally, we explore bystander intervention. This is another practice which has been determined to be efficacious when changing community attitudes and beliefs, especially when done effectively. Now that said, it's only being used by about half of schools. Bystander intervention is great because it can address two needs. It can address the need that fills a sexual assault prevention, and it can address a need that fills alcohol prevention. So it's certainly something worth considering. Now, this is best done when it's tailored to the specific needs of your community. It really works from an empowerment standpoint to encourage community members to take responsibility for collective well-being. It can also be paired, in many cases, with social norms marketing data to truly make a powerful impact. Now, a huge key to implementing a program with fidelity is to consistently evaluate it. If you were a part of our Critical Processes webinar, this may be familiar. When we think about developing strategic programs, a crucial component is data. Specifically, what are our learning objectives and what do we want to accomplish? Once we have a sense of our big picture goals, we can do a little bit of research to see what the most effective ways are to accomplish change, conduct formative research. So we develop strategies to implement programs, we ensure the programs are aligned with what's going to work in our community, and then we execute the program. That's it, right? Problem solved. Not necessarily. It's one thing to lay out a program that you think will solve a problem, but we know that in practice this doesn't always happen. A crucial piece of program development is evaluation, and it should not be an afterthought. Evaluation should ideally be a continuous part of our process. I know with all the time we have, it's so easy to do, right? But in a perfect world, an evaluation plan would be created before a program even is. Are we using the questions that we're asking in the planning phase of a program during the evaluation phase as well? Process evaluation is about making sure we did what we planned to do, while summative evaluation is about making sure we accomplished what we wanted to. And in some instances, both may not in fact happen. In the end, it's important to be cognizant of the fact that programmatic evaluation is not always going to yield perfect outcomes. But by asking the right questions, we can begin to look critically at our own efforts, the progress that we've made, and other potential barriers or supporters of success. It has taken a great deal of time for problems like sexual assault and alcohol abuse to arrive on our campuses, and it's going to take a fair amount of time to eradicate them. But by asking the right questions, you're that much more informed of your own process, which is sometimes just as important as the final outcome. So now let's shift gears a little bit and explore the student voice. We live in a time in which it is emerging more often in prevention efforts and is really becoming a crucial one to engage in the programming process. We're currently in a society of student activists, and the student voice is becoming increasingly more critical to the conversation. Increased awareness and activism on campus brings forward a wide array of both assets and challenges for university administrators. This quote from the Chronicle highlights that perfectly. The administration doesn't need to organize it because students will. Engaging students and helping to channel their efforts can be incredibly beneficial for your programming efforts, but really must be done with care. It's our job as professionals to help create communities in which students can learn, can live, and can feel safe. And students should not have to feel that the creation of programs, policies, processes, or events that help with this is entirely on them. It's also important to recognize that some of our primary job functions exist as a result of student activism. This is particularly true for those of us that work in the violence prevention sphere. Students are seeking opportunities to get involved, and this can be an incredible resource to your programmatic efforts. The key is to help channel their activism into something that can actually create meaningful change within the broader system. How can the energy and effort of student activism be balanced and encouraged while being part of a systemic higher education culture? Here are a few ideas for channeling the student voice. Students can assist with the design of programs. Things like pilot studies and focus groups can help gain insight into whether or not the message we're hoping to send is actually getting through. They can also help with the evaluation of ongoing programs or existing programs that have been established. Finally, we can utilize students in the delivery of programs like bystander intervention training, AOD awareness trainings, and a variety of other ongoing efforts. Another more focused way that schools are supporting students is through formalized peer education programs. So in a moment, I'm going to be diving into some case studies of two institutions that are doing really fantastic work with regards to peer education programs. But first, I'd like to get a sense of your own experiences. So if you don't mind just taking a minute to answer this poll to indicate whether or not you're using a peer education program. Great, more than half of you have responded. So far it looks like most people are using a robust peer education program. About 11% aren't using one at all. We've got about 20% that are considering it. Hopefully you're going to get some good insight into that. And about 30% have students who help, but not a formalized program. Great, we'll give it one more minute, see what we end up with. All right, thank you. So it looks like 39% have a robust peer education program. About 28% have students who help, but not a formalized program. 13% do not have any kind of program, and about 19% do not have a program, but are considering it. Excellent, thank you for answering. So this group is somewhat in alignment, somewhat not, with what we've seen from our diagnostic inventories. 85% of the schools that we surveyed through our alcohol diagnostic and our sexual assault diagnostic are using peer educators in some capacity, with about the same amount being supervised by staff in student affairs. And the average amount of training for many peer education programs is 21 to 40 hours. One school that's doing really just fantastic work in their peer education efforts, particularly those related to violence prevention, is the Aurora Center at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. Their violence prevention peer educators go through a rigorous recruitment process that's followed by a 40-hour rape crisis training. Now, not all students end up becoming rape crisis counselors, but the training ensures that they have the same survivor-centered, empathic training around the issue. Students have the opportunity to use the skills that they've learned through working on a hotline, or they can put their strengths to use in a variety of other ways. But the training really ensures that all of the students have been educated with the skills and knowledge to support peers regardless of what their role is within the office. They also host monthly student meetings, which allows for socialization, debriefing, and a chance for ongoing training. But what's really impactful is, last year, they tallied up how much they saved through utilizing peer educators, and they determined the savings to be about $400,000 annually. Peer educators help fill the roles of paid employees by assisting with crisis management after as well as a tremendous amount of time likely for the staff in their office. If you're using a peer education program or thinking about it, it's so important to collect this data to show the true impact of your work. Another school that found success and laid a great foundation for peer educators is the University at Buffalo. Within their comprehensive peer education program, training consists of two components. First is a 30-hour, 2-credit course, which explores aspects of peer education and public health and aligns students with historical and theoretical perspectives on the issues. Following completion of this course, students participate in a 24-hour leadership seminar where they learn critical skills such as dealing with resistance and adapting in challenging situations. Buffalo uses a track system for helping students grow and progress within the program, and there are requirements and expectations within each step of their journey. Students begin as affiliates, which is an opportunity for those students who want to be involved but have yet to complete the course. Next are members, which are those students who have completed the course but don't necessarily lead specific sessions. The next tier up are leaders, who are the primary facilitators of trainings, and they've not only completed the course, but have actually applied and been accepted for this particular position. And finally, there are advisors, which are a small group of students who represent the program within the community as lead trainers, and they're also the media representatives. Additionally, personal and professional growth is a huge part of the experience at Buffalo. Following each training, students are evaluated both by themselves and by their peers in order to identify strengths and potential areas for improvement. They, like UMNTC, also focus on the importance of self-care. If you're deciding to utilize a peer education program, there are some crucial items that need to be considered. The first is to make them a part of your strategic plan. Be deliberate in your efforts. Have a clear vision for what you want to accomplish from a peer education program, and really use that to drive your efforts. Next, honor and guide their strengths and interests. Each student, as they evolve through the college experience, will certainly have unique perspectives, talents, and skills that they're working to hone. Allow them to maximize those. Support the students who have a passion for photography or graphic design or writing, and allow some wiggle room in your plans to accommodate them. It may even end up filling a gap that you didn't know existed. Create opportunities for reflection. As we know from doing this work, peer education can be really challenging work. We're dealing with some really challenging issues. It's important to provide opportunities for educators to reflect on those experiences and to process them both with professionals and with their peers. Build a network. All of the schools that I spoke to about peer education reflected the importance of community. Most recruit students through a broader network which continues to grow. This network also helps to foster what we call the healthy majority, and really encourage students on campus to build healthy communities. Now, you saw the previous slide about how much money UMNTC has saved through their peer education program, so it's really important to collect data to assess and evaluate your efforts. It validates the work you're doing, it allows opportunities to tweak or modify as needed, and it can come in incredibly handy when you're advocating for additional funding or resources. And finally, but perhaps most importantly, invest time in training and education. The message of wellness on campus is one that is crucial, and peer educators will no doubt be an ambassador of that. It's very important that they be trained accordingly. So some crucial components for the training of your peer educators includes letting them in on your vision, teaching them how to care for and nurture themselves, as well as how to navigate potential disagreements or difficult conversations. They should also be fully aware of resources, both for their peers and for themselves, as well as their role in reporting if they're required to do so. Finally, peer educators should be absolutely fluent in any specific language that you have around how your institution wants to communicate about the issues of health and wellness. They're then becoming an ambassador of your message. As we wrap up for the day, I want to leave you with this. Programming truly is a process. It's not a rigid, never-changing entity, but rather something that should be as fluid and evolving as the issues themselves, as well as what we know about them. More is not always better. Finding one or two key programs that integrate with your broader prevention goals can be much more impactful than spinning your wheels, putting on events every week that only a handful of students attend. I know, I've been there. Be deliberate in your efforts and intelligent with your time because it is absolutely valuable. Programs should be implemented with synergy, and when possible, they should be collaborative. They're one piece of a much larger prevention puzzle, so it's really important to think about them from that lens. And finally, programs are only as good as the institutional support behind them. You could be creating the most groundbreaking, forward-thinking, amazing programs in the world, but if there are not policies in place, institutionalized messages, and follow-through behind them, then they won't be nearly as effective at creating long-lasting change as they could. So that wraps up the presentation portion of today's event. I'm so thankful to have had this time with you, and I'd love to be able to answer any questions that you have. We've got about 8 minutes, so feel free if you do have questions to type them in. I know that some have actually come through as I was talking, and I'll try to answer as many of them as possible. If I don't get to your question, I'll be sure to write them down, and I'll most certainly reach out to clarify. Great. Got a few questions coming in here. Okay, excellent. So this is a really good one. Someone asked, in the slide relating to most and least used population-level strategies for sexual assault prevention, why is online education listed in both columns? Okay, really good question. I'm actually going to go back to that slide just to clarify so everyone can see it. Here we go, this one. Okay, so yes, as you see, online education is listed both on the left and on the right. The column to the left, we're referring to online commercial education. So this is a program like Haven, for example, that has been developed and tested for efficacy. The column on the right, you'll notice the R is not there. So in that column, we're referring to a homegrown course, for example, that's been developed at an institution. When we think about online education, the areas that people really seem to prioritize are content, are design, administration, data, and compliance. So in the past, it's not to say that necessarily you'll notice homegrown programs doesn't mean that they're not effective. It's just they're not as effective as those that have been developed with care and thoughtfulness and multiple case studies and data behind them. So fantastic question. Glad I was able to clarify. All right, looks like we have time for one more question, maybe a couple more questions. Okay, here's a really good one. Is it ever okay to use invited speakers as part of my prevention efforts? Awesome question, and actually I'm really glad that I have the chance to clarify that. So earlier you may know that I've alluded a couple times to invited speakers not having a lot of efficacy. The short answer is yes, of course it's okay to use invited speakers when appropriate. Now when we say that there's limited efficacy behind them, it's not to suggest that they should never be used, but rather if they are to be used, that it's done deliberately and part of a larger strategic plan. So for example, if you have a budget of $3,000 and you hope to use it to bring in a guest speaker, but don't plan to connect it to any other prevention efforts, then that certainly isn't advisable. But say, for example, you found a really captivating guest speaker that fills a need within your prevention plan and it's going to help accomplish a larger picture goal, then by all means, go for it. Most guest speakers are also trained and will be more than happy to hear about your strategic plan and maybe even tailor their efforts accordingly. And I've actually recently had a few conversations with folks who are using guest speakers to help with their prevention efforts towards targeted student groups, so LGBTQ students, students of color, and the feedback on those has been great. So by all means, if it integrates with your broader strategic plan and if it fills a need on your campus, then go for it, invite a guest speaker. I guess the biggest advice would be just make sure that you are really being strategic about how you're connecting the dots. Okay. Now, unfortunately, it looks like we're running out of time, so we don't have time for any more questions. But that said, I will make an effort to reach out to those of you who did have questions that we didn't get to and answer them as best as I can. Now, with all that we've covered today, I know that it can probably be easy to feel overwhelmed, hopefully empowered at the same time. Fortunately, we're a community of professionals, and there are a lot of resources within the community that can support this work. You'll see them referenced in the slides that I spoke about. Along with a copy of this webinar, I'll also send along links to some of the resources that I've mentioned. Now, at the end of this webinar, you'll also receive a link to an evaluation. Please spend some time filling it out. In the spirit of peer education, we'd love to hear more about your thoughts on this webinar series, this particular webinar as a whole, and the series in general, so that we can continue to provide you with the best content possible. I want to thank you all for your time, and I hope that everyone enjoys a happy and healthy holiday season. McKaylee, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Erin. That was outstanding. Thank you for the great presentation and for answering those questions from the audience. So you brought us to the end of our, as we said a few times throughout the event, this was our fourth and last event for the webinar series we held this fall around campus prevention best practices. So we started the series with the topic of how to make your prevention efforts an institution-wide program. We then explored the theme of making prevention a process-driven effort. Last time, we explored the ways policies can be used as a critical tool and not just a checkbox item in your prevention strategy. And finally, today, we concluded with programming and how this integrates with all the previous elements we discussed, so kind of bringing it all back home. We hope we all enjoyed the series and found the content and the data analysis that we each time presented to you useful to develop new approaches to the pressing issues you're faced with at your institutions every day. This will be our last event for a year, and so we look forward to seeing you again in 2017. We will be holding webinars regularly as we do, so I'd like to join Erin in wishing everybody a happy holiday season. Just a couple reminders on my part, as usual. Copy of the slides, as Erin mentioned as well, and a full recording will be sent to all of you at the end of the event, along with a couple useful resources. I'd also like to remind everybody that EverFi as a company provides a comprehensive training platform for Title IX, campus sexual assault, and substance abuse prevention. So if you would like, for those of you who are still with us, to receive a demo of our courses and online training platform, you can just type demo in the question box at the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll have one of our training experts reach out to you and show you around the platform. So that is just, you just type demo in there and we'll get back to you. So finally, one last thing before we part is Erin was also mentioning earlier, when you log out, well, we'll be terminating the webinar in just a few minutes. When you log out, there will be a final poll for you to fill out that is related to your feedback on this event. We do value your feedback greatly, so if you could please just fill in the poll and let us know what you thought about it, that would be great, so we can keep providing you with the content that you care for the most. Again, thanks for all of you that have been with us today and that have been following our different webinars this year. We wish you a great holiday season to end 2016 and We look forward to seeing you again in 2017. Thank you. Bye from Everfi.